The cold seared her lungs with each shallow breath she took. Eleanor stood by the open grave, the world a blurry wash of gray and black. The sky above was a heavy blanket, threatening rain that never seemed to fall, only hanging there like a perpetual sorrow. She clutched the rough fabric of her black dress, feeling the chill seep into her bones. But it was nothing compared to the icy emptiness inside her. Arthur was gone. The words echoed in her mind, meaningless and deafening all at once. The minister's voice, a low rumble, spoke of peace and eternal rest. Eleanor barely registered the sound, her gaze fixed on the coffin, a dark, polished box that held everything she had ever known. A single tear, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. What was one more tear in an ocean of grief? Her fingers felt numb, her joints stiff, as if her body had forgotten how to move, how to feel. A low murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered at the graveside. Neighbors, their faces drawn with pity, offered hushed condolences. She recognized some of them. Mrs. Henderson from down the road, old Mr. Peterson, who used to trade eggs with Arthur, a few of the younger families who had recently moved to the valley. Their faces were kind, but their words dissolved into an indistinct buzz, like bees around a hive. Eleanor only heard the wind, a mournful sigh rustling through the bare branches of the oak trees. Each shovel of earth that struck the coffin lid sent a jolt through her, a visceral pang that tore at the fragile edges of her composure. The smell of damp earth rose, rich and pungent, mingling with the faint, sweet scent of lilies from the wilting wreaths. It was a smell she would forever associate with this unbearable day, with the finality of this moment. Her throat tightened, a knot of unshed tears making it difficult to swallow. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to conjure Arthur's face. His hearty laugh, the way his hand felt in hers, strong and warm. But all she found was a void, a chilling absence. A hand, light and tentative, rested on her arm. Eleanor opened her eyes to see Sarah, a kind face from the next farm over, offering a silent gesture of support. Eleanor managed a weak nod, her lips unable to form a single word of thanks. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, each one a sharp blade. Arthur fixing the fence last spring, his brow furrowed in concentration. Arthur holding her close by the fire on a cold winter's night. Arthur, just days ago, planning the next season's crops, full of life and vigor. It felt like a cruel trick, a nightmare she could not wake from. She tried to breathe deeply, but her lungs refused to fully expand. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken sorrow and a strange, creeping unease. As the last of the mourners began to disperse, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, a few voices carried on the wind, clearer than they should have been. Eleanor's attention, dulled by grief, snagged on a phrase, then another. Such a shame, the Vance place. Blackwood's been eyeing that land for years. Wonder what will happen now with Arthur gone. The words were like pebbles dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through her numbness. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The name was a dark shadow in the valley, a man whose ambition was as vast and cold as his sprawling estate on the hill. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that was not entirely from the biting wind. Her head swam slightly. She tried to shake off the unsettling thoughts, reminding herself that grief played tricks on the mind, turning shadows into monsters. But the whispers persisted, like a persistent hum beneath the surface of her sorrow. They say he wants it for that new timber project, a low voice continued, barely audible. With Arthur gone, it'll be easy pickings now. Eleanor's grip tightened on her dress. Easy pickings. The phrase was ugly, disrespectful, and it settled deep in her gut like a stone. She turned her head slightly, trying to identify the speakers, but their faces were already melting into the receding crowd. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed slightly. Sarah's hand steadied her. Eleanor forced a small, tight smile. She needed to focus, to get through this day. But the seed of suspicion, tiny and sharp, had been planted. The next few days blurred into an indistinguishable haze of silent rooms and unspoken grief. Eleanor moved through the farmhouse like a ghost, each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the window pane, a painful reminder of Arthur's absence. The silence in the house was deafening, a hollow space where his laughter and his steady presence used to be. She slept little, haunted by fragmented memories and the gnawing ache in her chest. Then, just 3 days after Arthur's burial, a sleek black car, far too opulent for their dusty farm road, pulled up to the house. Eleanor watched it from the kitchen window, a knot forming in her stomach. It could only mean one thing. A tall man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit emerged, his movements precise and unhurried. He carried a slim leather briefcase. There was no mistaking the air of calculated purpose that surrounded him. He was a Blackwood man. She knew it instantly. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath and walked to the door. Her hands, calloused from years of farm work, trembled slightly as she opened it. The man offered a small, practiced smile that did not quite reach his cold blue eyes. "Mrs. Vance, I presume?" he asked, his voice smooth and unsettlingly calm. "My name is Mr. Harrison. I represent Mr. Silas Blackwood." Eleanor merely nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She gestured him inside, her jaw tight. She led him to the small, sun-drenched kitchen, the heart of their home, now feeling strangely alien and exposed. The aroma of brewing coffee, her comfort in these dark days, seemed out of place in his polished presence. "Please have a seat," she managed, her voice rough. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands shaking so much that some of the dark liquid sloshed over the rim. She didn't offer him any. Mr. Harrison sat at the old wooden table, the same table where she and Arthur had shared countless meals, planned their future, and dreamed their dreams. He placed his briefcase carefully beside his chair, his gaze sweeping over the worn but cherished room, assessing every detail. Eleanor felt a sudden surge of protectiveness, a fierce instinct to guard this space from his intrusion. "Mrs. Vance, I am so terribly sorry for your loss," he began, his tone almost perfunctory. Mr. Blackwood was deeply saddened to hear about Arthur's unfortunate accident. The word accident hung in the air, cold and sharp. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. That same uncomfortable sensation from the funeral pricked at her. She took a slow sip of her bitter coffee, letting the warmth spread through her, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, cutting to the chase, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. She wanted him out, quickly. He leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to one of practiced concern. "Well, Mrs. Vance, Mr. Blackwood is a practical man. He understands that a farm of this size can be a heavy burden for a woman on her own, especially in these difficult times." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He also has a vested interest in the parcels of land adjacent to his estate." Eleanor's gaze hardened. She knew exactly which parcels he meant. The fields that bordered Blackwood's property, the very land Arthur had just planned to plant with winter wheat. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Mr. Blackwood is prepared to make you an offer, Mrs. Vance," he continued, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a crisp, official-looking document. "A very fair offer, all things considered. It would allow you to settle your affairs, perhaps move closer to family, and relieve you of the considerable stress of running this operation alone." He slid the paper across the table toward her. Eleanor looked down at it, her eyes scanning the bold numbers, then the smaller print. Her breath hitched. It was insultingly low, a fraction of what the farm was actually worth, even in a down market. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a hot wave of anger pushing past her grief. "This is a joke," she stated, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. She pushed the paper back towards him with the tip of her finger. Her fingers locked around her coffee cup. She knew if she let go, she'd spill it. Mr. Harrison's practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Mrs. Vance, perhaps you are still in shock. This is a very generous proposition. The market is uncertain, and without Arthur, the farm's value, without Arthur, the farm is still ours," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gaining strength, each word deliberate. "It has been in the Vance family for 3 generations. This is my home. This is his legacy." She thought of Arthur, of his calloused hands that had worked this very soil, of the sweat and love he had poured into every acre. To sell it now for such a paltry sum felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for, everything they had built together. It was a further desecration of his memory. "I understand your sentimental attachment, Mrs. Vance," Mr. Harrison said, his tone now edged with a condescending patience. "But sentiment does not pay the bills. Mr. Blackwood is simply offering a practical solution to a difficult situation." "Practical for whom?" Eleanor shot back, her hazel eyes flashing with a spark of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. The bitterness of her coffee now matched the bitterness in her mouth. "Certainly not for me." He sighed, a subtle dismissive sound. "Mr. Blackwood is prepared to close this transaction quickly and discreetly. A clean break, Mrs. Vance. It would save you a great deal of trouble." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken threat. Trouble. What kind of trouble? The implication was clear, cold, and calculated. It was not a generous offer. It was a predatory demand. The whispers from the funeral suddenly coalesced into a chilling clarity. Blackwood wasn't just eyeing their land, he was circling, waiting to pounce. And now that Arthur was gone, he saw his chance. Eleanor stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Her heart throbbed, a drumbeat of fury and fear. "Mr. Harrison, please leave." Her voice was low but firm, leaving no room for argument. He picked up his briefcase, his face now devoid of any pretense of sympathy, a hard, unyielding mask. "Think about it, Mrs. Vance," he advised, his voice dropping to a low, almost menacing tone. "Mr. Blackwood is not a man to be trifled with. This offer will not stand indefinitely." He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing ominously on the hardwood floor, then fading as he reached his car. Eleanor watched from the window as the black vehicle reversed, turned, and disappeared down the long, winding driveway. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white. A tremor ran through her body, a mixture of rage and profound fear. The silence in the farmhouse returned, but it was no longer merely the silence of grief. It was charged, heavy with the weight of this new threat. She walked through the empty rooms, the familiar scent of wood smoke and old books, of Arthur's pipe tobacco, now mixed with the acrid tang of fear. The silence felt like a shroud, suffocating her. She felt utterly alone, completely vulnerable. She wandered into the living room, her gaze sweeping over the mantelpiece. Her eyes landed on a small crystal vase. Inside it, wilting, its petals soft and brown at the edges, was a single crimson rose. Arthur had given it to her just a week before, plucked out from the bush by the back porch. He had always been so thoughtful, so good at noticing the small things that brought her joy. "Just because," he had said, pressing it into her hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had a way of making her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. Eleanor reached out, her fingers carefully closing around the delicate stem. The petals felt like velvet, now dry and fragile. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She brought the dying flower to her nose, inhaling its last faint, sweet scent, a ghost of what it once was. Her mind replayed their last conversation, his plans for the farm, his unwavering optimism. He had been so vibrant, so full of life. Her grip on the rose tightened, the thorns pricking her skin, a small, sharp pain. Why had he died? The official explanation from the doctor, a sudden heart attack, had seemed plausible enough at the time. Arthur had worked hard, often pushed himself too far, but now with Mr. Harrison's visit, with the vultures circling so quickly, a chilling thought began to take root in her mind. What if it wasn't an accident? What if Arthur's death was not simply a cruel twist of fate, but something far more sinister? The possibility, cold and stark, settled over her like a heavy shroud. Silas Blackwood wanted their land, and now Arthur was gone. The timing was too precise, the offer too brazen, the veiled threats too unsettling. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet farmhouse, clutching the wilting rose, the delicate petals crumbling in her trembling hand. A profound, chilling suspicion washed over her, freezing the tears on her cheeks, transforming her grief into a simmering, terrifying question. A sharp wire snap, taut as a fiddle string, jolted Eleanor from sleep. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the still, pre-dawn farm. Her heart seized, The familiar morning quiet had been broken by something alien. She pulled on Arthur's cardigan and stepped into the damp, cold air. The eastern sky bruised purple and gray, painting the landscape in an eerie light. Frost crunched under her boots as she followed the sound. Her eyes scanned the boundary fence, leading up to Blackwood's estate. Then she saw it, a section of sturdy wire, cleanly cut. The jagged ends glinted menacingly. Fury shot through her. This was no accident. No animal could do such a thing. This was deliberate, malicious. She crouched, fingers tracing the cold, sharp edges. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the chill, but from the dawning realization of a sinister presence. The metal bit her skin, leaving a faint, stinging red mark. The next morning, the livestock were disturbed. The barn's usual comforting scent held an acrid tang of fear. Cows lowed nervously, eyes wide and rolling. A heavy oak door, latched the night before, hung open on one groaning hinge. The other lay splintered on the ground. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. She soothed the animals, her voice a low murmur. A young calf had a small cut on its flank. Her hands, usually steady, trembled as she stroked its warm fur. The threat to her animals, her livelihood, was a raw ache. She remembered Arthur's gentle strength. She was all they had now. A week later, her old tractor refused to start. Eleanor, wiping grease from her brow, found the fuel line tampered with, a tiny cut rendering it useless. She knelt in the dust, gasoline sharp in her nostrils, jaw clenched. Each incident, small on its own, wove into a pattern of calculated intimidation. Her grief for Arthur, once a bottomless wall, was solidifying into a hard, protective shell. The shock of his death had dulled her senses, but these sharp acts forced her to see clearly. She had to fight, to protect what Arthur had loved and built. One Tuesday, a stark white envelope arrived. Its official seal stood out from the usual bills. George, the postman, avoided her gaze, mumbling a quick goodbye before hurrying back to his truck. The mailbox click echoed the sudden silence. Eleanor's earth-stained fingers tore it open. Legal jargon filled the pages. Words like boundary dispute, right-of-way, and resurvey hammered her fragile peace. The notice came from Silas Blackwood's legal firm. Cold dread seeped into her bones. She sank onto the porch swing, trying to grasp the convoluted sentences. They claimed a portion of her land, the old access road, in a strip by the creek, citing an obscure century-old deed. This was land Arthur had always called theirs, passed down through generations. He had proudly shown her old maps, tracing their family lines. Her mind reeled. This was no coincidence. The cut fences, disturbed livestock, sabotaged tractor, all part of a larger plan. Blackwood was not trying to buy her out. He was trying to break her, to force her off her land. The paper felt heavy, a physical burden. The air tasted metallic, like impending storm. Her breath hitched. She thought of Arthur, his kind face, his dedication. He had worked this land his entire life. The idea of Blackwood claiming even a foot was an insult, a desecration. A tear, hot and stinging, traced her cheek. It was not surrender, but fierce, protective rage. The next day, a dark green truck rumbled down her driveway, kicking up dust. It stopped near her barn. Two burly men emerged. One was Harris, Blackwood's foreman, carrying a surveyor's tripod. The other had a measuring tape. Adrenaline surged through Eleanor. She gripped her broom as if it were a weapon, her heart hammered with defiance. They were brazen, she thought, to come to her home so openly. The scent of hay now felt like a prelude to battle. She walked towards them, her steps firm. Harris looked up, his eyes dark and flat, meeting hers without respect. His cold indifference infuriated her. He saw an obstacle, not a person. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," Harris said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured towards the equipment. "Just a preliminary survey. Orders from Mr. Blackwood regarding property line adjustments." A hot flush crept up Eleanor's neck. Her voice was steadier than expected, yet edged with fury. "There are no property line adjustments, Mr. Harris. This is my land. It has been the Vance family's for generations." She gestured to the fields, golden in the morning light. Harris grunted, dismissing her. He turned to his companion. "Set up by the old oak, John. We'll start heading west." He spoke as if she were not there. Her blood boiled. You will not set foot on my land with that equipment, Eleanor declared, her voice rising. She stepped directly into their path, her hands clenched around the broom handle. You have no right. Harris's lips hinted at a smirk. We have legal documents, Mrs. Vance. A notice was sent. Mr. Blackwood is exercising his rights. He spoke with practiced nonchalance. He took a step forward. Eleanor held her ground. The taste of dust and anger filled her mouth. I received your notice, and I will fight it. This farm is not for sale, not a single inch of it. Do you understand? She met his gaze with fierce intensity. Harris's smirk vanished. He held her gaze, a silent challenge. Then, with a curt nod to his companion, he said, We'll be back, Mrs. Vance, where Blackwood always gets what he wants. He turned, walking back to the truck. His companion, after a pause, followed. Eleanor watched them go, her chest heaving. Adrenaline drained, leaving her hollow. The truck disappeared over the rise. The silence was deafening. She stood, broom clutched, eyes fixed on the empty spot. Her defiance was a tiny ember in a vast darkness, stubbornly refusing to die. It was a promise to Arthur, to herself. The following days were a blur of work and gnawing anxiety. Every shadow held threat. Every sound made her heart leap. She mended cut fences, hands blistering. She repaired the barn door, hammering new hinges. She fixed the tractor's fuel line, learning new skills. Each repair was an act of resistance, a small victory. She often spoke to Arthur, whispering to the empty air, They won't get it, Arthur. I won't let them. His memory was a constant presence, a source of sorrow and strength. She felt his hands guiding her, his presence reassuring. The scent of damp earth and hay, the taste of her fear, sharpened her senses. One late afternoon, as the sun set, Eleanor returned to the mended fence. A few staples had come loose. She knelt, muscles aching, hammer cumbersome. The air grew colder, carrying damp earth and distant wood smoke. Farm animals settled for the night, their soft sounds filling the air. She hammered the last staple, testing the wire. Straightening, she stretched her back. Her eyes, tired but sharp, swept towards Blackwood Manor. It stood dark against the fading light, its windows reflecting sunset like cold, unblinking eyes. Then she saw it, a faint movement at Blackwood's property edge, near old oaks. A figure, too far to distinguish, a shadow against the purpling sky, but its stillness spoke volumes. It was watching her. The air grew thin, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The metallic taste of fear returned. Her eyes narrowed, but the figure remained indistinct, a silent, menacing sentinel. It was a clear message. She was not alone, not unobserved. Every move, every mend, every act of defiance was noted. This knowledge settled like a heavy shroud. Her farm, her sanctuary, felt like a stage with her an unwilling performer under a watchful, hostile gaze. The last flicker of sunlight faded, plunging the landscape into twilight. The silent figure remained, a chilling testament to her enemy's constant watch. The chilling sensation of eyes on her back never truly left Eleanor after she saw that distant figure. It clung to her, a cold phantom limb of dread, even as she moved through the familiar rooms of her silent farmhouse. Her hands, calloused and strong, paused often in their tasks, a cup of tea growing cold in her grasp as her mind drifted, pulled by an insistent current of fragmented memories. The whispers of suspicion, once faint, now echoed loudly in the quiet spaces of her home, demanding attention, demanding answers. She found herself replaying moments from Arthur's last weeks, small details she had dismissed, fleeting expressions she had overlooked. Each recollection now felt like a cruel trick, a breadcrumb trail she had been too blind with love and trust to follow. Her thoughts often returned to the old mill, its decaying stone and waterlogged wheel, a familiar landmark on their property. Arthur had always loved that place, a quiet spot where he would go to think, to fish, sometimes just to sit. But in the months before his death, his visits to the mill had taken on a different quality. They were no longer the simple, peaceful retreats she had grown accustomed to. He would leave with a sudden urgency, sometimes without a word, slipping out the back door as if he feared being seen. The scent of damp earth and old timber would cling to his clothes when he returned, a smell that now felt heavy with unspoken secrets. She remembered one Tuesday afternoon, the sky a bruised purple before a storm. Arthur had been in the barn, fixing a hinge, his tools clanging rhythmically against the metal. Suddenly he had stopped, listening intently to something only he could hear. His eyes, usually so warm and open, narrowed, and a line of worry had etched itself between his brows. He dropped his wrench with a clatter, a sound that startled the chickens, and without a word walked quickly toward the creek, disappearing into the thick stand of willows that hid the mill from view. Eleanor had watched him go, a knot forming in her stomach. She had called out, asking where he was off to, but he hadn't even turned his head. Later that evening, when the rain lashed against the windows and the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, she had tried to ask him about it. He had been unusually quiet, picking at his dinner, his gaze distant. "Just checking on something," he had mumbled, his voice tight, avoiding her eyes. He had offered no further explanation, and she, accustomed to his occasional reticence, had let it pass. A wave of bitter regret washed over her now, a sharp physical pain in her chest. She should have pressed him then. She should have followed. The weight of her own unquestioning acceptance felt like a betrayal of the man she loved. The mill, overgrown and silent, began to loom larger in her mind. It was a place of forgotten history, its gears rusted, its purpose long past. But Arthur had seen something in it, felt something there that had drawn him away from her, from their life, into a world of hushed comings and goings. The wind would often carry the faint, mournful creak of its decaying structure, a sound she had once found comforting, now filled with an unsettling sense of mystery. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his face, to find some hint in his remembered smile, but it remained elusive, clouded by the shadow of what she now knew. The memories shifted then, from the outside world of the mill to the intimate, quiet space of their kitchen. Late nights had become a common occurrence in their home, long after the moon had climbed high and the sounds of the farm had settled into a gentle hum. Arthur, typically one to retire early after a day of hard labor, had taken to spreading out old maps on their sturdy oak table. The faint yellowed parchment, brittle with age, would rustle softly as he unfolded them, the smell of dust and forgotten ink filling the air. He would lean over them, a single lamp casting a circle of warm light on his bent head, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor would often wake, drawn by the dim glow seeping from beneath the kitchen door. She would pad silently to the doorway, watching him, a quiet anxiety beginning to bloom in her heart. He would trace lines with a calloused finger, sometimes muttering to himself, words she couldn't quite make out. "The boundary," she once heard him whisper. "It's all wrong." He seemed to be arguing with the very paper, his jaw tight, his posture tense. He was never like this. Not about farm business, which he usually handled with an easy, confident air. This was different. It held a desperate urgency. One particular evening she had approached him, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. "Arthur, what are you doing up so late?" she had asked softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He had flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with a startled fear she had never seen before. He'd quickly gathered the maps, folding them with a frantic haste, stuffing them into an old leather satchel he kept under the table. His hands had trembled slightly, a detail she had noticed then with mild concern, now with a jolt of alarm. "Nothing, Eleanor," he had said, his voice a little too loud, a little too quick. "Just reviewing some old field plans. Nothing to worry about, my love." He had smiled then, a strained, almost artificial smile that had not reached his eyes. She had felt a pang of hurt, a sense of being deliberately excluded from his thoughts. He had always shared everything with her, their lives a tapestry woven together, thread by thread. This new secrecy was a tear in that fabric, one she had tried to mend with understanding, attributing it to the pressures of the farm. Now she understood it as a deliberate act of protection, shielding her from a growing threat. The memory of his nervous glances at those maps, his furtive movements, now screamed a terrible truth. He had been looking for something, checking something, something critical to their land, to their very home. The realization made her breath catch, a sharp, icy hand clutching at her throat. And then, the phone call. It was etched into her memory with the vivid clarity of a nightmare. The kitchen was still warm from supper, the scent of roast chicken lingering in the air. Eleanor had been washing dishes, the warm water soothing her tired hands, humming a tune Arthur loved. The phone, a heavy black rotary model on the wall, had rung, its sudden shrill cry cutting through the quiet evening. Arthur, who had been reading the newspaper by the fire, had answered it, his usual cheerful greeting replaced by a cautious, hushed tone. She hadn't consciously been listening at first, just aware of the low murmur of his voice, the faint static hum of the phone line. But then a word had pierced through the clatter of the dishes, a single word spoken with an intensity that had made her freeze mid-motion. The claim. Her hands had stilled in the soapy water, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Arthur's back had been to her, his posture rigid, one hand cupped around the receiver as if trying to trap the words before they could escape. A few moments later, another word, spoken even softer, but with a terrifying weight. Silas. The name had hung in the air like a poisonous vapor, instantly recognizable. Silas Blackwood, the cold, ruthless landowner whose shadow had begun to fall over their valley. Eleanor had felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the kitchen. Her mind, even then, had linked the two words, the claim and Silas, though she hadn't understood their full implication. She had only known instinctively that something was terribly wrong. Arthur had continued to speak in hushed tones, his voice tight with an unfamiliar tension. She had caught fragments. Proving it. Documents. He can't. Each piece was a tiny spark of unease, growing into a flickering flame of dread within her. When he finally hung up, he had stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He hadn't noticed her standing there, a silent sentinel by the sink, water dripping from her hands. She had held her breath, afraid to break the fragile silence that seemed to hold all his fear. When he finally turned, he had jumped, seeing her. A forced smile, even more strained than the one about the maps, had appeared on his face. "Just a neighbor, Eleanor," he had said, his voice too casual, too light, asking about some hay. She had known, with a certainty that had settled deep in her bones, that he was lying. Her eyes had searched his, trying to find the truth, but they were clouded, distant. "Arthur," she had begun, her voice quiet. "What was that about a claim? And Silas?" His eyes had hardened then, a flash of something she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of fear and irritation. "Nothing for you to worry your head about, my dear," he had replied, his tone dismissive, a rare note of impatience in his voice. "Just old land squabbles. It's all settled." He had then quickly changed the subject, talking about the weather, the crops, anything to steer her away from the topic. She had retreated, wounded by his refusal to confide in her, but too trusting to push further. Now, the memory of that conversation, his evasiveness, his sudden change of demeanor, felt like a physical blow. The pieces were all there, scattered in the rubble of her memory, waiting for her to assemble them. Arthur had been worried about Silas. He had been looking into some claim related to their land, poring over maps, making secretive trips to the old mill. He had known something was amiss, something dangerous, something that ultimately led to his death. The official story of a fall, a tragic accident, crumbled into dust in her choyinda, replaced by a terrible, clear vision of calculated malice. Silas Blackwood wanted their farm, and Arthur had stood in his way. He had found something. She was sure of it. Something vital that Blackwood desperately sought to suppress. A cold, hard resolve began to form inside Eleanor, a bitter steel replacing the soft ache of her grief. Her tears now were not just for the loss of her husband, but for the profound injustice of his murder, for the quiet desperation he must have carried alone. She felt a burning need to uncover whatever he had been hiding, to finish what he had started. He had left her not just a farm, but a puzzle, a trail of breadcrumbs meant to lead her to the truth. She remembered how he used to hide little notes for her, playful messages tucked into unexpected places, a habit from their early courtship. He was a man who left clues. She walked through the silent farmhouse, the familiar scent of wood polish and dried lavender now mingling with the phantom scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco. Her hand brushed against the smooth, worn wood of his bedside table. There, resting precisely where he always left it, was his old, leather-bound Bible. Its pages were soft from years of turning, its cover etched with the faint marks of his thumb. Arthur was a man of quiet faith, and he often found solace in its words, marking passages that resonated with him, sometimes with a small, penciled note in the margin. A flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent, stirred within Eleanor. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had left her one more message, hidden within those sacred pages. The chilling sensation of eyes on her back never truly left Eleanor after she saw that distant figure. It clung to her, a cold phantom limb of dread, even as she moved through the familiar rooms of her silent farmhouse. Her hands, calloused and strong, paused often in their tasks, a cup of tea growing cold in her grasp as her mind drifted, pulled by an insistent current of fragmented memories. The whispers of suspicion, once faint, now echoed loudly in the quiet spaces of her home, demanding attention, demanding answers. She found herself replaying moments from Arthur's last weeks, small details she had dismissed, fleeting expressions she had overlooked. Each recollection now felt like a cruel trick, a breadcrumb trail she had been too blind with love and trust to follow. Her thoughts often returned to the old mill, its decaying stone and waterlogged wheel a familiar landmark on their property. Arthur had always loved that place, a quiet spot where he would go to think, to fish, sometimes just to sit. But in the months before his death, his visits to the mill had taken on a different quality. They were no longer the simple, peaceful retreats she had grown accustomed to. He would leave with a sudden urgency, sometimes without a word, slipping out the back door as if he feared being seen. The scent of damp earth and old timber would cling to his clothes when he returned, a smell that now felt heavy with unspoken secrets. She remembered one Tuesday afternoon, the sky a bruised purple before a storm. Arthur had been in the barn, fixing a hinge, his tools clanging rhythmically against the metal. Suddenly he had stopped, listening intently to something only he could hear. His eyes, usually so warm and open, narrowed, and a line of worry had etched itself between his brows. He dropped his wrench with a clatter, a sound that startled the chickens, and without a word walked quickly towards the creek, disappearing into the thick stand of willows that hid the mill from view. Eleanor had watched him go, a knot forming in her stomach. She had called out, asking where he was off to, but he hadn't even turned his head. Later that evening, when the rain lashed against the windows and the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, she had tried to ask him about it. He had been unusually quiet, picking at his dinner, his gaze distant. "Just checking on something," he had mumbled, his voice tight, avoiding her eyes. He had offered no further explanation, and she, accustomed to his occasional reticence, had let it pass. A wave of bitter regret washed over her now, a sharp physical pain in her chest. She should have pressed him then. She should have followed. The weight of her own unquestioning acceptance felt like a betrayal of the man she loved. The mill, overgrown and silent, began to loom larger in her mind. It was a place of forgotten history, its gears rusted, its purpose long past. But Arthur had seen something in it, felt something there that had drawn him away from her, from their life, into a world of hushed comings and goings. The wind would often carry the faint, mournful creak of its decaying structure, a sound she had once found comforting, now filled with an unsettling sense of mystery. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his face, to find some hint in his remembered smile, but it remained elusive, clouded by the shadow of what she now knew. The memories shifted then, from the outside world of the mill to the intimate, quiet space of their kitchen. Late nights had become a common occurrence in their home, long after the moon had climbed high and the sounds of the farm had settled into a gentle hum. Arthur, typically one to retire early after a day of hard labor, had taken to spreading out old maps on their sturdy oak table. The faint yellowed parchment, brittle with age, would rustle softly as he unfolded them, the smell of dust and forgotten ink filling the air. He would lean over them, a single lamp casting a circle of warm light on his bent head, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor would often wake, drawn by the dim glow seeping from beneath the kitchen door. She would pad silently to the doorway, watching him, a quiet anxiety beginning to bloom in her heart. He would trace lines with a calloused finger, sometimes muttering to himself, words she couldn't quite make out. "The boundary," she once heard him whisper. "It's all wrong." He seemed to be arguing with the very paper, his jaw tight, his posture tense. He was never like this, not about farm business, which he usually handled with an easy, confident air. This was different. It held a desperate urgency. One particular evening, she had approached him, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. "Arthur, what are you doing up so late?" she had asked softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He had flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with a startled fear she had never seen before. He'd quickly gathered the maps, folding them with a frantic haste, stuffing them into an old leather satchel he kept under the table. His hands had trembled slightly, a detail she had noticed then with mild concern, now with a jolt of alarm. "Nothing, Eleanor," he had said, his voice a little too loud, a little too quick. "Just reviewing some old field plans. Nothing to worry about, my love." He had smiled then, a strained, almost artificial smile that had not reached his eyes. She had felt a pang of hurt, a sense of being deliberately excluded from his thoughts. He had always shared everything with her, their lives a tapestry woven together, thread by thread. This new secrecy was a tear in that fabric, one she had tried to mend with understanding, attributing it to the pressures of the farm. Now she understood it as a deliberate act of protection, shielding her from a growing threat. The memory of his nervous glances at those maps, his furtive movements, now screamed a terrible truth. He had been looking for something, checking something, something critical to their land, to their very home. The realization made her breath catch, a sharp, icy hand clutching at her throat. And then, the phone call. It was etched into her memory with the vivid clarity of a nightmare. The kitchen was still warm from supper, the scent of roast chicken lingering in the air. Eleanor had been washing dishes, the warm water soothing her tired hands, humming a tune Arthur loved. The phone, a heavy black rotary model on the wall, had rung, its sudden shrill cry cutting through the quiet evening. Arthur, who had been reading the newspaper by the fire, had answered it, his usual cheerful greeting replaced by a cautious, hushed tone. She hadn't consciously been listening at first, just aware of the low murmur of his voice, the faint static hum of the phone line. But then a word had pierced through the clatter of the dishes, a single word spoken with an intensity that had made her freeze mid-motion. The claim. Her hands had stilled in the soapy water, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Arthur's back had been to her, his posture rigid, one hand cupped around the receiver as if trying to trap the words before they could escape. A few moments later, another word, spoken even softer, but with a terrifying weight. "Silas." The name had hung in the air like a poisonous vapor, instantly recognizable. Silas Blackwood, the cold, ruthless landowner whose shadow had begun to fall over their valley. Eleanor had felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the kitchen. Her mind, even then, had linked the two words, the claim and Silas, though she hadn't understood their full implication. She had only known instinctively that something was terribly wrong. Arthur had continued to speak in hushed tones, his voice tight with an unfamiliar tension. She had caught fragments, proving it, documents. He can't. Each piece was a tiny spark of unease, growing into a flickering flame of dread within her. When he finally hung up, he had stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He hadn't noticed her standing there, a silent sentinel by the sink, water dripping from her hands. She had held her breath, afraid to break the fragile silence that seemed to hold all his fear. When he finally turned, he had jumped, seeing her. A forced smile, even more strained than the one about the maps, had appeared on his face. "Just a neighbor, Eleanor," he had said, his voice too casual, too light, asking about some hay. She had known with a certainty that had settled deep in her bones that he was lying. Her eyes had searched his, trying to find the truth, but they were clouded, distant. "Arthur," she had begun, her voice quiet. "What was that about a claim? And Silas?" His eyes had hardened then, a flash of something she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of fear and irritation. "Nothing for you to worry your head about, my dear," he had replied, his tone dismissive, a rare note of impatience in his voice. "Just old land squabbles. It's all settled." He had then quickly changed the subject, talking about the weather, the crops, anything to steer her away from the topic. She had retreated, wounded by his refusal to confide in her, but too trusting to push further. Now the memory of that conversation, his evasiveness, his sudden change of demeanor, felt like a physical blow. The pieces were all there, scattered in the rubble of her memory, waiting for her to assemble them. Arthur had been worried about Silas. He had been looking into some claim related to their land, poring over maps, making secretive trips to the old mill. He had found something, she was sure of it, something vital that Blackwood desperately sought to suppress. The official story of a fall, a tragic accident, crumbled into dust in her mind, replaced by a terrible, clear vision of calculated malice. Silas Blackwood wanted their farm, and Arthur had stood in his way. He had known something was amiss, something dangerous, something that ultimately led to his death. A cold, hard resolve began to form inside Eleanor, a bitter steel replacing the soft ache of her grief. Her tears now were not just for the loss of her husband, but for the profound injustice of his murder, for the quiet desperation he must have carried alone. She felt a burning need to uncover whatever he had been hiding, to finish what he had started. He had left her not just a farm, but a puzzle, a trail of breadcrumbs meant to lead her to the truth. She remembered how he used to hide little notes for her, playful messages tucked into unexpected places, a habit from their early courtship. He was a man who left clues. She walked through the silent farmhouse, the familiar scent of wood polish and dried lavenders now mingling with the phantom scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco. Her hand brushed against the smooth, worn wood of his bedside table. There, resting precisely where he always left it, was his old leather-bound Bible. Its pages were soft from years of turning, its cover etched with the faint marks of his thumb. Arthur was a man of quiet faith, and he often found solace in its words, marking passages that resonated with him, sometimes with a small, penciled note in the margin. A flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent, stirred within Eleanor, a desperate plea to the universe. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had left her one more message, hidden within those sacred pages. The worn leather of Arthur's Bible still held the faint scent of him, of cedar and paper, a comfort Eleanor clung to in the silent house. She understood the Bible held no literal clue, but it had sparked a memory, a feeling that Arthur had left her something more tangible than sorrow. With a deep, shuddering breath, she moved toward the sturdy wooden chest in his small study, a room usually ignored. Dust motes danced like tiny golden spirits in the thin shafts of morning light slicing through the window. She pulled open the heavy lid, the dry sound of old wood groaning in protest. Inside, nestled amongst neatly tied bundles of letters and deeds, were Arthur's old journals and ledgers. Each book felt like a piece of him, cold and heavy in her hands, yet infused with his enduring presence. She ran her fingers over the faded covers, the rough texture of the canvas, remembering how he would spend quiet evenings hunched over them, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air in the study thickened with the scent of aged paper and a faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco, a ghost of her husband's habit. She could almost hear the steady scratch of his pen. Eleanor began to sift through the pages, her heart aching with every familiar line of his elegant script. She saw entries about crop yields, livestock sales, family expenses, the mundane details of their shared life. Her eyes, tired from countless nights without sleep, scanned methodically, searching for anything out of place, any deviation from the predictable rhythm of farm life. The silence of the room was broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages and the distant caw of a crow outside. Then, tucked into the margin of a ledger detailing the farm's yearly income from 3 years prior, she found it. Hastily scrawled in a different, darker ink was the phrase, "the old claim." It was underlined twice, almost violently, as if Arthur had pressed too hard in a moment of frustration or urgency. Her breath hitched in her throat, a cold wave washing over her. This was not a casual note. It was a desperate whisper from the past. A few pages later, beside a calculation for their annual property taxes, another note appeared, circled this time. Preserving the legacy. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced the words, a chill running down her spine. These were not the musings of a man planning a simple farm expansion. These were secrets. A new resolve settled deep within her, replacing the paralyzing grief with a sharp, clear focus. Arthur had been troubled, consumed by something he felt he needed to protect. She closed the ledger gently, the old wood creaking softly. Her next step was clear. She needed to understand what the old claim meant and what legacy Arthur had been so desperately trying to preserve. Her own farm, her home, now felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. She gathered the ledgers, the cryptic notes burning themselves into her memory. The town archive was a quiet, hushed place, smelling faintly of dust, old books, and a medicinal polish. High, arched windows filtered the harsh daylight, casting long, dusty shadows across rows of heavy oak shelving. Eleanor felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as she approached the formidable desk of Mrs. Henderson, the archivist, a woman whose spectacles seemed to magnify her already stern gaze. Mrs. Henderson, with her tightly pinned gray hair and starched collar, looked up, her expression unyielding. "I need to look at old land records," Eleanor said, her voice a little steadier than she felt. "Specifically for the Vance homestead and surrounding properties, going back as far as you can find." Mrs. Henderson gave a slow, assessing nod, her eyes scrutinizing Eleanor's determined face. A few moments later, Eleanor sat at a heavy wooden table, surrounded by stacks of brittle, yellow documents. The cool air of the archive seemed to press down on her, creating a sense of immense history. She felt the rough texture of ancient paper beneath her fingertips, each sheet a fragile testament to lives long past. The faint scratch of her pencil against her notebook was the loudest sound in the room. Hours bled into one another as Eleanor meticulously unrolled vast, hand-drawn maps, their ink faded but still legible. She traced the intricate lines of property boundaries, comparing each map to the next, her eyes straining in the dim light. She saw the familiar outline of her farm, but the borders shifted subtly from one century to another, like a living, breathing thing. Her brow furrowed in concentration. She cross-referenced dates, names, and property descriptions. She smelled the musty scent of damp paper and leather, a smell that clung to her clothes and hair. Then she found it, an older map, perhaps from the late 1800s, its details exquisitely drawn with fine, precise lines. The lines around her own property, her beloved Vance land, extended further, encompassing an area that, on more recent maps, belonged to Silas Blackwood. Her breath caught in her throat. She found discrepancies, subtle but significant, particularly around the creek and the old mill. Blackwood's current claims, the very ones he used to harass her, seemed to encroach upon land that had once clearly been part of the Vance estate. The cool air in the archive suddenly felt icy. She leaned closer, her nose almost touching the parchment, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She compared it to a modern survey map she had brought. The differences stark. The old mill, the very place Arthur had frequented, the place where she now knew he had been hiding something, was undeniably within her family's original boundaries. A strange, bitter taste filled her mouth, a mix of anger and revelation. This map was a silent scream across generations. Taking a much-needed break from the endless maps, Eleanor stretched her stiff shoulders. She picked up a small, leather-bound album she had found tucked away in a corner of Arthur's old desk drawer, an item she had initially overlooked in her frantic search for ledgers. The album was surprisingly light, its cover worn smooth from handling. Inside, nestled amongst other faded images of generations of Vance family, was a photograph, sepia-toned and fragile. It was a picture of two young boys. Her breath hitched, a gasp escaping her lips. It was Arthur, unmistakably, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, his hair a riot of auburn curls, a wide, gap-toothed grin on his face. Beside him stood another boy, a little older, with the same kind eyes, though a bit more serious. Thomas, Arthur's brother. They stood proudly, their arms around each other, in front of the very mill she had just seen on the old map, its weathered stones a backdrop to their youthful joy. She could almost hear the rush of the creek, the laughter of the boys. Eleanor traced the outline of their faces with a trembling finger, her eyes welling with unshed tears. The pain of Arthur's absence, the ache of their family's fractured past, converged in that single image. The mill was not just a landmark. It was a symbol, a place of shared history for the Vance brothers. Arthur had not merely visited an old structure. He had returned to a place rooted deep in his childhood, a place he had loved with his brother. The scent of the old photo paper felt like a memory itself. The photograph connected everything. Arthur, the mill, Thomas, and now the old claim. The pieces clicked into place, forming a coherent, if still shadowy picture. The reason for Arthur's secretive trips, his worried whispers, his urgent desire to protect his legacy, now made a terrible sense. He had been fighting a quiet battle, knowing that Silas Blackwood coveted what was rightfully theirs, what had always been theirs. Her heart squeezed with a fresh wave of grief for Arthur's silent struggle and a fierce burning resolve to finish what he had started. She looked back at the antique map spread out before her on the kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee mixing with the smell of old paper. Eleanor traced a faded line on the brittle parchment, realizing a significant portion of what Blackwood claimed as his, including the old mill, once belonged to the Vance family. A dust cloud rose from the distant lane, announcing his arrival. It drifted toward the farmhouse. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, her hand tight on her cold mug. A sleek, black automobile rolled slowly up the drive, its engine a low purr. It was Silas Blackwood's car. She felt its oppressive presence. He rarely left his manor. His appearance here felt like an invasion. Her breath hitched. She knew he would come, but the car idling by her porch still sent a shiver through here. The engine died, leaving an unnerving silence, broken only by chickens. A chauffeur, faceless in uniform, opened the rear door. Her heart thudded. Her usually steady hands trembled. Then Silas Blackwood stepped out. He was taller, broader, his dark suit contrasting with her familiar home. His slicked-back hair glinted. His cold, calculating eyes swept the farm, lingering on the ground Arthur had loved. He moved with absolute authority. A scent of expensive cigars and something sharp preceded him. Eleanor stood rooted, watching him approach the porch, her gaze unwavering. She would not hide. He moved slowly, his polished shoes crunching on gravel. He stood at the porch steps, offering a predatory smile that held no warmth. Eleanor, his low, gravelly voice scraped her nerves. My deepest condolences again, on your loss. The words were hollow. Nausea rose in her throat. Condolences from a man she suspected of Arthur's death felt like mockery. She kept her expression neutral, hiding her turmoil. Her fingers locked around the cold mug. She knew if she let go, she would spill it. Mr. Blackwood, she replied, her voice steady, you rarely grace us with your prominence. To what do we owe this unexpected visit? His smile widened, making her skin crawl. He took a step, his gaze still sweeping the fields as if claiming them. I am simply concerned, Eleanor. Arthur was a good man, a hard-working man. He paused, his eyes settling on hers. But perhaps not a man who prepared adequately for all eventualities. The implication hung thick. He spoke of her fragile state, her inability to manage the farm without Arthur. A bitter taste filled her mouth. She had worked this land with Arthur for years, her hands calloused, her back strong. She knew every furrow, every animal. Her grief was immense, but it had not broken her. It had forged her spirit into something harder. Arthur managed this farm well, she said, her voice firm, and I manage it now. Blackwood's gaze lingered on her, assessing. His head tilted as if considering a puzzle. Of course, a woman of your resilience, but the burdens, Eleanor, they can be heavy, especially for one so recently bereaved. He let the word hang, a weapon. Running a farm this size demands robustness, a robustness perhaps difficult to maintain under emotional duress. Eleanor felt cold anger, pushing it down, hardening into resolve. He was trying to chip away at her confidence, to make her feel small. He believed her grief would blind her, make her an easy target. He did not know the strength of a love violently ripped away, the ferocity of a woman protecting what remained. The scent of damp earth and hay, usually a comfort, now felt like a battleground, something she had to defend. I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, Mr. Blackwood, she stated, her chin lifting. Her knuckles were white on the mug. He chuckled, a dismissive sound. My dear Eleanor, I have no doubt of your spirit, but spirit alone does not pay taxes, mend a broken tractor, or navigate complex land ownership. His eyes narrowed. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. This farm has always been a point of contention. The boundaries, the old claims. Arthur was rather stubborn about such things. Eleanor's mind flashed to the old map, the faded lines. Blackwood's claims were false. Arthur's stubbornness was a fight for his family's rightful history. Blackwood was hinting at what she had uncovered, twisting it as a threat. The air vibrated with tension, farm sounds fading. She heard her own shallow breaths. "There are no contentions regarding the Vance farm, Mr. Blackwood," she said, challenging him. "Our family has held this land for generations." He sighed. "Yes, tradition. But the world moves on, Eleanor. Land values change. Opportunities arise." He gestured towards the fields as if they were his. "I understand your sentimental attachment, but sometimes a pragmatic decision is the kindest one." He paused, letting the implied threat sink in. For everyone involved. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "I have a generous offer for you, Eleanor. An offer to step away from hardship, to grieve in peace, to live comfortably." He pulled a folded document from his jacket, extending the crisp white paper. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill, a fair price for a property proving more trouble than it's worth." Eleanor did not reach for the paper. Her eyes locked on his, seeing cold ambition. She imagined Arthur's kind eyes, his strong hands working these fields. His presence bolstered her. This farm was his legacy, her inheritance, their life's heart. To give it up would betray everything he lived for. The ghost of his pipe tobacco seemed to comfort her. "I am not selling, Mr. Blackwood," she said, clear and unwavering. Her fingers ached on the mug. "This farm is not for sale, not ever." A dangerous flicker crossed Blackwood's face. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a tight line. His usually cold eyes now held a menacing edge. "Eleanor," he said, his voice harder, colder, stripped of false sympathy. "You are a widow. Bubishano. This farm is a vast undertaking. There will be foreclosures, legal battles over disputed boundaries, costs you cannot imagine." He leaned forward, his voice a hammer blow of intimidation, not a whisper. "You will be buried in debt. You will lose everything, gaining only heartbreak." His words, meant to crush her, ignited a furious fire. He spoke of foreclosures and legal battles, the tools he was already using to break her. He spoke of heartbreak, as if he knew Arthur's death had left a gaping wound in her soul. He stood there, the orchestrator of her misery, now pretending to be her savior, offering a pittance for the life he destroyed. Her grief, a suffocating blanket, transformed into a burning shield. The knowledge from Arthur's notes, the old maps, the mill's significance, all clicked. This man was her enemy, the killer. The air grew heavy with unspoken accusations. She tasted the metallic tang of fear, her own, and a flicker in his eyes at her defiance. He expected tears, a broken woman. He would not find one. "You misunderstand me, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, her quiet voice carrying conviction that surprised even herself. The words felt like stones. "I will not be buried in debt. I will not lose everything. This farm is mine, and I will fight." She met his gaze, her hazel eyes, usually shadowed by sorrow, now burning with fierce light. "And I believe," as she continued, each word a gauntlet thrown, "that Arthur would have wanted me to fight." A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. He was not used to defiance, especially not from a grieving woman on a dusty farm. His facade cracked, revealing raw anger. He stared, his cold blue eyes boring into hers as if she was searching for weakness. He found only steely resolve, mirroring his own. He drew back, the offer document still in his hand. "As you wish, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat, a simple threat. "But do not say I did not warn you. The world is unforgiving for those who refuse reason." He turned, his shoes crunching on gravel, walking back to his car with the same measured pace. The chauffeur, standing by the open door, closed it behind him. The engine purred to life, a low rumble. The car moved, picking up speed. Blackwood did not look back. He was a dark silhouette behind tinted glass, disappearing down the lane. Only a fading dust cloud remained in the lingering scent of his cologne. Eleanor remained on the porch, rigid, her hands gripping the cold mug, knuckles aching. The engine's hum faded, replaced by farm sounds, wind in the grass, a distant cow clucking chickens. Her breath came in ragged gasps, composure finally broken. A single tear escaped, hot on her cheek. Not of sadness, but anger, fierce resolve. She stood firm, her grief hardening into fierce resolve. A war had been declared, whether she wanted it or not. The dust of Silas Blackwood's departing car had barely settled on the long farm road when Eleanor Vance turned back toward her porch. A cold resolve had begun to set in, replacing the swirling anger and helplessness. The war Blackwood spoke of, the one he had already started, would not be fought on his terms alone. Arthur, her late husband, had left her breadcrumbs, a trail of clues leading away from despair and towards a fight. The old map and his cryptic notes now felt like a desperate plea, a final act of love urging her to look beyond the obvious. Her mind raced through the long, quiet hours of the night. She pictured the faded lines on the ancient map, the stark reality that a significant part of their land, the land Blackwood coveted, had always belonged to the Vances. Her gaze kept returning to the old mill, marked clearly on the old parchment, a place Arthur had loved and visited often. It was a place he frequented in the weeks before his death, a sanctuary for his thoughts, a place of quiet contemplation. The pieces finally clicked into place. The mill was more than a memory, it was the key. Dawn broke with a pale, hesitant light, casting long shadows across her fields. Eleanor ate a simple breakfast, the food tasting like ash in her mouth, her stomach a tight knot of nerves. She dressed in sturdy trousers and a thick work shirt, practical clothes for a difficult task. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and anticipation. She knew that if she found what Arthur had hidden, her life would change forever, and so would the dangerous path she was walking. The walk to the old mill was a familiar one, yet today it felt charged with an electric tension. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The path, usually a comforting passage through green fields, now seemed to stretch endlessly, each step a deliberate move towards an unknown future. The distant gurgle of the creek, usually a soothing sound, seemed to whisper secrets, urging her forward. As she drew closer, the mill loomed into view, a skeletal structure against the morning sky. Its stone walls, once robust and proud, were now crumbling in places, swallowed by creeping ivy and thick moss. The large wooden wheel, a symbol of its former purpose, stood still and broken, its paddles rotted away by years of neglect. A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine, not from the cold, but from the weight of memories and the enormity of her task. This was where Arthur had sought solace. This was where he had hidden his truth. She pushed open the heavy, creaking wooden door. The sound echoed through the cavernous interior, startling a flock of pigeons that burst from the rafters with a frantic flapping of wings and a flurry of dust. The air inside was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and time. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced through cracks in the roof and broken window panes, illuminating the stillness of the forgotten place. Eleanor stepped inside, her boots crunching on generations of accumulated debris. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, sweeping across the vast, empty space. Broken machinery lay scattered like the bones of some long-dead beast. Gears rusted, belts disintegrated. Cobwebs hung like tattered shrouds from every beam and corner, glistening faintly in the weak light. She felt a profound sense of Arthur's presence here, a phantom echo of his quiet contemplation, his careful planning. She could almost hear his measured breathing, see the thoughtful frown line between his brows. He would have known exactly what he was doing. Eleanor began her meticulous search, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the stone walls, probing the splintered wood of fallen beams. She moved slowly, systematically, guided by the memory of Arthur's cautious nature, his almost obsessive attentions to detail. He would not have left something important in plain sight. He would have chosen a place that was both accessible to him and utterly unremarkable to anyone else. Her eyes scanned the floorboards, the walls, the nooks and crannies where old sacks and broken tools lay discarded. She ran her hand along the rough-hewn stone of the mill's foundation, the cold, gritty surface a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin. The chill permeated her clothes, but her focus burned with an internal heat. She remembered Arthur's notes, cryptic references to the old claim and preserving the legacy. These were not just sentimental phrases, they were instructions, a map of his intent. Her fingers brushed against a section of the wall near what would have been the main water channel, a place where the stone was rougher, more uneven. A wave of frustration washed over her. The mill was vast, filled with countless places where something small could be hidden. Doubt began to gnaw at the edges of her resolve, a cold worm of despair threatening to consume her. What if she was wrong? What if Arthur had kept his secrets too well? Or perhaps if the documents had been lost to the ravages of time and damp? She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She thought of Arthur's gentle smile, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he was deep in thought. He had been a man who loved this land, who understood its history and its worth far beyond the simple harvest it yielded. He would not have simply surrendered it. He would have fought, quietly, carefully, with the patience of a farmer waiting for the perfect season. That patience, she realized, was what she needed now. She opened her eyes, renewed, her gaze sharpened by a fresh determination. Eleanor shifted her attention to the mill's lower level, where the water wheel mechanism would have been. The air here was even colder, damper, smelling strongly of mildew and stagnant water. She imagined Arthur standing here, perhaps sketching, perhaps simply thinking. He loved the sound of the creek. He often said it cleared his head. It was a place of peace for him, a place where he could think clearly and without interruption. This thought made her slow down to consider the space as Arthur would have. Her gaze fell upon a particular section of the mill's foundation, partially obscured by a dense curtain of overgrown ivy that snaked its way up from the creek bank. It was a low section, near where the water would have flowed, dark and shaded. The ivy seemed older, thicker here, its tendrils woven into a nearly impenetrable mat. Most people would have dismissed it as just another part of the mill succumbing to nature's relentless reclamation. But something about it caught her eye. Perhaps it was the way the ivy seemed unnaturally thick in one spot, or the slight discoloration of the stone beneath, a hint of a different shade, less weathered than the surrounding blocks. Or perhaps it was simply Arthur's spirit guiding her, nudging her towards the truth. She knelt down, the damp stone cold beneath her knees, and began to carefully pull away the thick, matted greenery. The ivy resisted, its small rootlets clinging stubbornly to the rough stone. Eleanor worked patiently, her fingers a blur of motion, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. As she cleared away the last of the tenacious vines, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. It was a stone, yes, but it was set differently, with a slightly wider gap around its edges than the others. It was a peculiar loose stone, almost imperceptible, unless one was actively looking, unless one knew exactly what to seek. A sudden electric jolt shot through her. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped within her chest. This was it. This had to be it. Every nerve in her body hummed with a mixture of dread and electrifying anticipation. Her hand, trembling slightly, brushed against the loose stone, and to her astonishment, it gave way, swinging inward on a crude hidden pivot, revealing a small hidden cavity behind it. The stone shifted, scraping against years of accumulated grime, a sound echoing in the silent mill. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, stained with dust and apprehension, worked at the edges, pulling the slab free from its ancient resting place. A small, dark cavity opened before her, smelling of damp earth and forgotten time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet gloom. She wondered what Arthur had hidden here, what secret he had guarded so carefully, even from her. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool air. It was the feeling of standing at the precipice of a truth she both craved and feared. She reached into the darkness, her fingertips brushing against something leathery and yielding. The sensation was foreign, yet strangely intimate, like touching a piece of Arthur himself. Her hand closed around a small, surprisingly heavy pouch. It felt aged and worn, the leather soft beneath her trembling grip. She pulled it out slowly, careful not to disturb its contents, her eyes scanning the empty cavity one last time. There was nothing else. Just this singular item, waiting for her, for this moment. Eleanor held the pouch, turning it over in her hands. It was a simple, dark leather, slightly water-stained in places, a testament to its long vigil in the damp mill wall. No clasps, no intricate fastenings, just a flap that tucks securely into itself. Her fingers fumbled with it, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it money? A letter? A desperate last confession? From Arthur? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her, concentrated in this small, weathered bag. She managed to open the flap, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. The air inside the pouch, trapped for so long, carried a faint, musty scent, like old paper and dried leaves. Her eyes peered into the opening, and she saw the soft, off-white gleam of paper. Gently, she coaxed the contents out. It was a single, large sheet, folded many times over, its edges softened by age. The paper itself felt fragile, almost crumbling to the touch, a yellowed testament to the passage of decades. Eleanor unfolded it with painstaking care, her gaze fixed on the ancient document. The parchment crackled softly as she smoothed it out against her knee, revealing lines of faded ink. Her eyes immediately fell upon the elaborate script at the top. The words were old, formal, almost poetic in their archaic phrasing. Then she saw the names. Vance. Her breath hitched. Her own name, Arthur's name, stretching back through generations. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, solidifying beneath a new, undeniable truth. She traced the words with a tentative finger, each stroke revealing more of the hidden story. It was a deed, a land grant, meticulously detailing boundaries and ownership, signed and sealed with a forgotten flourish. It clearly outlined the Vance family's long-standing claim to the disputed land, the very acres Silas Blackwood now coveted. Her eyes scanned the dates, seeing how far back the lineage stretched, how deeply rooted her family was to this soil. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was history, undeniable and sovereign. The ink was faded but legible, each looping letter a silent defiance against the avarice that sought to erase it. She saw descriptions of the land, landmarks she recognized from childhood, from Arthur's own stories. The old oak tree by the creek, the south pasture, even the boundary stone near the Blackwood estate. It all matched. It all confirmed. This land, this farm, this home was theirs. It had always been theirs. A wave of dizziness washed over Eleanor. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the cold, damp stone floor of the mill, the ancient wall a rough comfort against her back. The deed lay open in her lap, a beacon in the dusty gloom. The truth of Arthur's foresight, his quiet struggle, hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had known. He had prepared. He had seen this coming, long before she even suspected the shadows gathering around their farm. A choked sob escaped her lips, quickly followed by another, then another, until the quiet mill was filled with the sound of her raw, heartbroken cries. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the grime on her cheeks. They were tears of grief for Arthur, for the burden he had carried alone, for the silent fear he must have lived with. They were tears of anger at Blackwood, at his cruel deception, his ruthless pursuit of what was never his. And they were tears of an overwhelming, profound relief, the proof, the undeniable proof. She imagined Arthur late at night, his brow furrowed with worry, carefully planning, meticulously hiding this document. He must have known the danger, the threat Blackwood posed. He had acted not out of fear, but out of a deep, abiding love for their land, for their future. He had protected her, even in his absence, even in death. The realization was both a comfort and an agony. He should have told her. They could have faced it together. But perhaps he hadn't wanted to burden her, or perhaps the truth was too dangerous to whisper aloud. The weight of the deed felt immense in her hands, a tangible link to Arthur, to his legacy, to the fight he had started and now unknowingly passed to her. She remembered his tired eyes in the weeks before his death, the way he would sometimes stare out at the fields, a faraway look on his face. She understood now. He hadn't been lost in thought. He had been strategizing, planning her defense, ensuring her future. He had been a silent guardian, a quiet warrior. The air in the mill, once heavy with decay, now seemed to hum with Arthur's presence. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, telling her what to do, guiding her forward. This deed was his final, most powerful message. It was a testament to his love, his loyalty, and his unwavering belief in justice. He had laid the groundwork for her, provided the weapon she needed, and now she had to wield it. Her fingers tightened around the brittle parchment, careful not to damage its fragile surface. The weight of it was suddenly less about grief and more about purpose. It was a shield against Blackwood's lies, a sword to fight his injustice. It was the key to reclaiming what was rightfully theirs, to honoring Arthur's memory not just with tears but with triumph. The sobs began to subside, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. Clutching the deed, Eleanor wept, not just for Arthur's cleverness, but for the heavy burden of proof he has left her. Knowing this document is both her salvation and her greatest weapon. The brittle parchment crackled softly in Eleanor's grip, a paper-thin shield against a world suddenly turned treacherous. The moon, a cold, indifferent eye, cast long shadows through the farmhouse window as she carried her discovery from the mill, the dust of ages clinging to her clothes and hair. Her legs ached with the climb, her mind reeling with the weight of the document nestled against her chest. She needed light, a steady flame to truly see the words that Arthur had protected, the truth that had cost him his life. She moved through the silent house, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet, a stark reminder of her solitary existence. In the kitchen, a single oil lamp flickered to life, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Its warm glow fell upon the scarred pine table, illuminating the yellow deed as Eleanor carefully unrolled it. The air in the room, usually thick with the scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco and fresh baked bread, now tasted metallic, like fear and anticipation. Her fingers, still trembling from the discovery, smoothed the aged paper, tracing the faded ink. Names, dates, boundary lines meticulously detailed, some familiar, some lost to the passing years. The Vance name appeared again and again, stretching back through generations, a deep root in the very soil Blackwood now coveted. Her eyes burned as she read, each word a slow, deliberate hammer blow against the false narrative Blackwood had woven. This document did not merely state ownership. It screamed legitimacy, a defiant echo from the past. Arthur had known. He had always known. The thought brought a fresh wave of tears, hot and stinging, blurring the ancient script. He had carried this secret, this fragile proof, while she had worried about daily chores and the coming harvest. He had borne the burden of their family's legacy, protecting it even as Blackwood's shadow loomed ever larger. A profound ache settled in her chest, a mix of sorrow for his solitude and overwhelming gratitude for his foresight. She wished he were here to share this moment, to see his cleverness rewarded. But he was gone, and the deed, his final act of protection, was now hers to wield. She spent the long hours of the night lost in the document's embrace, trying to absorb every detail. The paper felt like a living thing, warm from her touch, humming with forgotten history. The faint scent of old paper and something else, perhaps the lingering trace of Arthur's hands, filled her senses. She remembered his intense focus in the weeks before his death, his quiet evenings spent hunched over maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. Now it all made a terrible sense. He had not been merely managing the farm, he had been protecting a birthright. The realization settled deep within her bones. Blackwood's claims were not just aggressive, they were a monstrous lie. His legal notices, his threatening visits, his relentless pressure to buy the land, all of it built upon a foundation of sand deliberately constructed to deceive and dispossess. The deed was irrefutable. It proved the Vance farm, especially the disputed section around the old mill, had always belonged to them, passed down through legal means and meticulously recorded. Blackwood's entire operation was fraudulent, a calculated theft. The implications were chilling. If his claim was fraudulent, then his actions were criminal. And if his actions were criminal, then Arthur's death. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, the official story of an accident, A fall from a horse now felt like a cruel joke, a flimsy veil over a dark truth. Blackwood would stop at nothing. He had wanted this land so badly that he had orchestrated Arthur's demise, removing the only man who truly knew the depths of his deception. A cold fury, slow and steady, began to burn within her. She rose from the table, the deed clutched tight in one hand, and moved to Arthur's small study, a room she had avoided since his passing. It smelled faintly of old books and dust, a place where Arthur had found solace among words. Her eyes scanned the shelves, searching for anything that might shed more light, any guide to navigate this new terrifying landscape. She pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume, its title embossed in gold, Property Law, Statutes, and Precedents. Its pages were brittle, its language archaic, but she hoped for answers. Eleanor sat back down at the kitchen table, the legal tome open beside the deed. The weight of the old book felt immense in her arm. She struggled with the dense prose, the convoluted sentences that seemed to purposely obscure rather than clarify. Her vision blurred from exhaustion, from the endless stream of tears she had shed, but she forced herself to focus. She searched for terms like adverse possession, title claims, easements, trying to match the dry legal definitions to the vibrant history outlined in her family's deed. The technicalities were daunting, a thick forest of words designed to confuse. She felt like a small boat tossed on a vast, churning sea, holding onto a single precious map. The map was clear, yes, but the waves were powerful, and she was alone. The more she read, the more she understood the complexity of the fight ahead. A deed, no matter how valid, was only as strong as the legal framework that upheld it and the lawyers who presented it. Blackwood had an army of them, sleek and sharp, ready to tear apart any challenge. Her heart pounded with a desperate urgency. This was not merely about owning the land. It was about honoring Arthur's sacrifice, about securing justice. But how could she, a farm widow with limited funds and no legal experience, stand against a man like Blackwood? He was a titan, his influence reaching into every corner of the county. His wealth a seemingly endless resource. He owned politicians, he owned judges, he owned every leverage point imaginable. A shiver ran down her spine, not from the chill of the night, but from the cold, hard truth of her isolation. She remembered the foreman's sneering face, the watchful eyes from Blackwood Manor, the subtle threats. They had tried to break her spirit, to wear her down into submission. And now she had found the very thing they feared, the key to unraveling Blackwood's elaborate lie. This deed was her salvation, yes, but it also made her a target, a lone figure holding a match in a field of dry tinder. The thought of facing Blackwood in a courtroom, his lawyers dissecting her story, twisting every truth, filled her with a profound weariness. She imagined his cold, calculating eyes, his predatory smile, confident in his power. She pictured herself standing there, vulnerable, while he commanded the attention of the room, his words dripping with false authority. The image was paralyzing. She was strong, yes, but she was not invincible. She was grieving, still raw with pain, and utterly outmatched in this particular arena. The weight of it all pressed down on her, an invisible hand pushing her further into the hard wooden chair. Her head throbbed, and her eyes felt gritty. The oil lamp began to sputter, its flame dancing precariously, mirroring the fragile state of her resolve. She closed the law book with a soft thud, its contents still largely a mystery, its implications terrifyingly clear. She could not do this alone. She simply could not. The truth, however powerful, needed an advocate, a champion, to stand beside her. She rose and walked to the window, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness. The familiar silhouette of the barn stood stark against the fading night sky. The air, cool and damp, carried the faint, earthy scent of the fields. Her gaze drifted across the land that Arthur had loved, the land she was fighting for. She saw it as Arthur must have seen it, not just dirt and crops, but a living history, a legacy. Her gaze then settled on the distant outline of Blackwood Manor, a dark, oppressive mass on the horizon, a constant, looming threat. She paced the kitchen floor, the silence of the house amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. Each step echoed the questions swirling in her mind. Who? Who could possibly stand with her? Who possessed the strength, the knowledge, the sheer will to confront Blackwood in his empire of deceit? Her mind raced through the few names she knew in town, local farmers, small-time merchants. None of them had the influence, the legal savvy, or perhaps even the courage to challenge a man as ruthless as Silas Blackwood. She thought of Arthur's gentle strength, his quiet determination. He had been so careful, so deliberate in hiding this deed. He must have known the danger. He must have anticipated this fight, but he had prepared only the weapon, not the warrior to wield it. A fresh wave of despair threatened to overwhelm her. She felt like a general with a brilliant strategy, but no army. Her mind was a whirlwind of anxieties, each thought a fresh assault on her weary spirit. What if she lost? What if Blackwood discovered she had the deed before she could act? He would crush her, surely, with the same cold efficiency he had likely used on Arthur. The thought was a bitter bile in her throat. She had to be smarter, faster, more strategic. This was not a fight of brute force, but of cunning and law. She stopped pacing and leaned against the cool window frame, her forehead pressed against the glass. The air outside was growing lighter, a pale gray bleeding into the black. A lone bird chirped, a small sound in the vast emptiness. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind, to find a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. She needed help. Not just any help, but someone who understood Arthur. Someone who understood the value of this land. Someone who had a reason to fight. A name, unbidden, whispered itself into her consciousness. A name she had not truly considered in years. A name heavy with a shared past and unresolved pain. Thomas, Arthur's brother. The thought was like a sudden, unexpected shock, both electrifying and terrifying. She had pushed him from her thoughts, just as he had pushed Arthur, just as they had all pushed each other away after that bitter argument so long ago. The memory of the estrangement was a dull throb in her mind, a wound that had never truly healed. Arthur rarely spoke of Thomas, and when he did, it was with a distant sadness, a quiet regret. She remembered Thomas as a younger man, full of a stubborn pride that mirrored Arthur's own. He had left years ago after a furious disagreement that had ripped a hole through the Vance family, leaving silence and unspoken resentments in its wake. But now, in this desperate hour, his name resonated with a strange, undeniable pull. He was family. He shared Arthur's blood, his history. He, more than anyone else, might understand the significance of this deed, the depth of Blackwood's villainy. The idea of reaching out to him, of breaking that long, painful silence, filled her with a profound trepidation. It would mean confronting old wounds, reopening scars that had long been left untouched. Yet, alongside the fear, a desperate hope began to bloom, fragile but persistent. Thomas was Arthur's brother. He might be the only one who truly cared enough, who had a strong enough connection to Arthur's memory to stand with her. He was her last, best chance. The sun was now a faint orange line on the horizon, promising a new day, but Eleanor knew this day would bring a confrontation unlike any she had ever faced. She knew what she had to do, even if the thought of it made her heart pound, with a mixture of dread and a fierce, urgent resolve. The silence of the farmhouse felt like a weight pressing down on Eleanor as the late afternoon light faded. She clutched the deed, its fragile parchment a testament to Arthur's foresight, and the enormous burden now resting on her shoulders. The name Thomas echoed in her mind, a ghost from a past she had hoped to leave buried. Reaching out to him meant unearthing years of painful silence, and the thought made her stomach clench with a raw, unfamiliar fear. She walked to the worn kitchen table, the wood scarred with generations of use, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. The inkwell, usually reserved for farm accounts, felt heavy in her hand. She stared at the blank page, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. How could she begin a letter to a man who had not spoken to her or Arthur in nearly a decade? The words seemed to disappear before they even formed, swallowed by a vast cold emptiness. Her grief for Arthur was a constant ache, a dull throb beneath every thought. Yet, interwoven with that sorrow was a fierce, burning need for justice, a desperate desire to protect what Arthur had died for. That desire was pushing her towards Thomas, a man she barely knew anymore, a man whose last words to Arthur had been steeped in anger. Each attempt to write felt like a betrayal of her own pride, a humbling act she never imagined she would undertake. She tried to compose a formal opening, something polite yet urgent. "Dear Thomas," she wrote, the pen scratching softly on the paper. She paused, the simple greeting feeling hollow and inadequate. What followed that greeting? How did one convey a plea for help, a demand for family loyalty, after so many years of neglect? She crumpled the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and tossed it onto a growing pile. Another sheet. This time she tried to be more direct, more emotional. "Thomas, Arthur is gone, and it wasn't an accident." Her hand trembled as she wrote the words, the raw truth of them making her eyes sting. But then what? Could she simply dump this horrific revelation on him in a letter, without context, without the chance to see his face or gauge his reaction? It felt cruel and somehow too vulnerable on her part. She folded that sheet too, adding it to the discard pile. The task felt impossible. Each word she considered a potential landmine. She knew the story of the estrangement, though she had never been a direct participant in the final bitter words. Arthur rarely spoke of his brother after that day, the wound too deep, too personal. But the memory of that argument, recounted to her by Arthur in hushed, pained tones years ago, still resonated with a chilling clarity in her mind. It had taken place right here, in this very farmhouse, on a blustery autumn evening, much like this one. Arthur had wanted Thomas to stay, to work the land with him, to build a future for the Vance name on the farm that had been theirs for generations. Thomas, younger by a few years, had seen only drudgery and limitation in the fertile fields. He had dreams of the city, of trades and skills that promised a different kind of prosperity, a faster ascent than the slow, backbreaking rhythms of farming. Their father, a quiet man, had already passed, leaving Arthur as the head of the household, burdened with expectations. "This land is our legacy, Thomas," Arthur had pleaded, his voice thick with emotion, his hands gesturing towards the window as if to encompass the entire farm. "It is in our blood. Father would have wanted us to keep it together." Thomas, younger then, full of restless energy and a yearning for a life beyond the dirt, had scoffed. "Legacy? It is a prison, Arthur. This farm will break your back before it makes you a fortune. There is no future here, not for me." Eleanor, then Arthur's young wife, had stood in the doorway, listening to the escalating tension, her heart sinking with each cutting word. She remembered the air crackling with unspoken resentments, years of differing ambitions finally boiling over. Arthur, always so dedicated to the land, had seen Thomas's desire to leave as a personal affront, a rejection of their shared heritage. Thomas had viewed Arthur's stubborn devotion as a foolish refusal to embrace progress, a blind loyalty to the past. "You think you are better than this land, Thomas?" Arthur had asked, his voice low, dangerous. "Better than our father? Better than me?" Thomas had thrown his hands up, a gesture of exasperated surrender. "I think I am better than waking up every day to the smell of cow manure, Arthur. I want more than this small life. If that makes me better, then perhaps I am." The words had hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Eleanor remembered Arthur's face, pale and tight with fury, a vein throbbing at his temple. He had taken a step towards his brother, and for a terrifying moment, Eleanor thought he might strike him. But then Arthur had stopped, his shoulders slumping, and he had simply said, his voice barely a whisper, "Then go. Go and find your grand life, but do not expect to find your way back here." Thomas had left that night, his belongings packed quickly, the sound of his truck fading into the darkness, leaving a gaping wound in the family. The silence he left behind had been deafening, a constant reminder of the fractured bond. Years turned into a decade, and the chasm between the brothers only deepened. Arthur, in his quiet way, had grieved the loss of his brother as deeply as he had grieved their father. He never spoke of Thomas again, at least not to Eleanor, though sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him sigh, a sound laden with unspoken regret. Now, as Eleanor sat at the same table, the ghost of that argument seemed to hover over her, making her fingers stiff, her mind clouded. How could she possibly bridge that chasm with a mere letter, especially now when Arthur was gone, and the circumstances were so dire? She needed him, not just as a brother-in-law, but as Arthur's blood, as someone who might still hold a flicker of loyalty to his lost sibling. The irony was bitter, a twist of fate that demanded she swallow her pride and beg for help from the very man who had once scorned their life. She picked away his pen again, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. She had to focus, to push past the emotional baggage. Blackwood was not waiting for her to reconcile family differences. He was circling, a predator sensing weakness, and she had already given him too much time. The deed lying folded on the table beside her was proof, but it was useless if she stood alone. A letter was too slow, too susceptible to being ignored or lost. It also allowed for too much explanation, too much room for Thomas to dismiss her plea as a desperate widow's delusion. She needed something stark, undeniable, something that would cut through the years of silence with the force of a blow. A telegram. Its brevity was its strength, its urgency inherent in its form. It would demand immediate attention, leaving little room for polite refusal or drawn-out contemplation. She reached for a small pad of paper, usually used for grocery lists, and began to draft the telegram in short, clipped phrases. No flowery language, no emotional pleas, just facts. Thomas Vance, urgent. Arthur's death not accident. Blackwood involved. She reread it, her brow furrowed. Too blunt? Not enough information? But what else could she say without giving away too much, without inviting questions she couldn't answer in a few lines? She added another sentence, a direct call for action. Need your help, Eleanor. It felt cold, almost impersonal, but perhaps that was best. It left no room for misinterpretation of her intent. She was not asking for condolences. She was asking for an ally. The brevity also concealed the extent of her desperation, the trembling of her hands, the fear that coiled in her gut. It was a plea disguised as a command, a lifeline thrown across a vast, dark chasm. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed, its brassy notes echoing in the quiet. It was already dark outside. She had spent hours wrestling with this, the emotional toll far greater than any physical labor on the farm. She had to send it tonight. No more hesitation, she grabbed her coat, the heavy wool a familiar comfort against the chill, and the small wad of cash she kept for emergencies. The short drive into town felt longer than usual, the familiar road stretching out like a winding path into the unknown. The old telegraph office was still open, a single lamp glowing dimly in its window. Inside, the air smelled of stale paper and quiet industry. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as she entered, his eyes curious. Eleanor placed the small pad of paper on the counter, her finger tracing the words. I need to send this telegram, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The clerk read it, his expression unreadable, and then nodded, beginning to tap out the message on his machine. Each click and whir of the mechanism felt like a drumbeat, sealing her fate, pushing her further into this dangerous, uncertain war. She paid him, the small coins feeling heavy and significant in her palm, and walked back out into the cold night air. The stars were bright above the town, indifferent to her small human drama. She drove back to the farm, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating familiar landmarks that suddenly felt alien. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. With the telegram sent, Eleanor felt a profound sense of vulnerability wash over her. It was a dizzying mix of relief and terror. She had made her move, gambling on a fractured past, on a brother's lingering love for another. Would Thomas even acknowledge her plea, or would the years of silence prove too deep a grave for their connection? Could he possibly offer aid against a man as powerful and ruthless as Silas Blackwood, a man who had already proven he would stop at nothing? She had cast her desperate message into the void, and now all she could do was wait, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. An old pickup truck rumbled down the dusty farm road, pulling Eleanor from her quiet thoughts. She stood on the porch, her hands clenching the rough wood railing, her breath catching. The truck coughed, sputtered, then died near the barn, sending up a cloud of dust that settled over the dry grass. A tall figure, Thomas, unfolded from the driver's side, moving with a familiar stiffness. His cautious stride approached the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the fields, then the porch, finally settling on Eleanor. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work-worn jeans, his face etched with sun and unspoken burdens. His brown eyes, so like Arthur's yet harder, held a guarded wariness that cut Eleanor deep. Years of silence separated them, a chasm carved by a forgotten argument and two brothers' stubborn pride. Now she had to dismantle that barrier, piece by painful piece. Eleanor swallowed, dust in her mouth tasting like ash, her heart drumming frantically against her ribs. The air felt heavy, thick with dry earth and their fractured past's ghosts. Thomas reached the bottom step, his gaze unwavering, saying nothing as he waited, arms crossed, a silent challenge in his posture. "Thomas?" Eleanor managed, her voice a reedy whisper, alien in the vast quiet. He gave a curt nod, his lips pressed thin. "Eleanor." His voice was low, gravelly, betraying nothing, and the formal address felt like a brick wall. She gestured towards the porch swing. "Come in, please. There is much to tell you." He hesitated, his eyes sweeping her face for something she could not name, a flicker of concern softening his gaze for a second before hardening again. He climbed the steps, each footfall heavy on the old wood, following her inside. The farmhouse, usually warm, now felt like a stage for an inevitable confrontation, its cool shade offering little relief from the humming tension. Eleanor led him to the kitchen, the home's heart Arthur had loved fiercely. She poured him a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, the ice clinking loudly. He took it with a murmured thanks, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, sending a jolt through her. She sat opposite him at the worn kitchen table, where Arthur had spread his maps and where they had shared meals and dreams. "I know this is sudden," Eleanor began, her voice still shaky. "I know it has been a long time, but I would not have called you, nor sent that telegram, if it were not important, desperate even." Thomas took a slow sip of water, his eyes fixed on the glass's condensation. "The telegram said Arthur's death was not an accident." His voice was flat, but the words hung heavy, mirroring her own pain. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of grief threaten her, her throat tightening, tears pricking her eyes. She squeezed them shut, trying to compose herself, to find strength to relay the unthinkable. "It was not, Thomas," she said, her voice cracking now. "It was not an accident. Silas Blackwood is responsible." Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Blackwood? What are you talking about, Eleanor?" His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Arthur was kicked by a horse. That is what the sheriff said." "The sheriff works for Blackwood," Eleanor retorted, her words tumbling out, fueled by rage and sorrow. "Everyone in this town fears him or serves him. Arthur found something that proved Blackwood was trying to steal our family's land." Unable to sit still, she stood abruptly and walked to the counter where she had placed the leather pouch, her fingers, still bearing the faint scent of old earth, trembling as she retrieved it. Its weight, the fragile yellow document inside, felt like a sacred trust. She turned back to Thomas, holding it out. "Arthur knew," she continued, her voice gaining strength, fierce determination replacing the tremor. "He knew Blackwood was coming for the farm. He was trying to protect it, to protect us, and he hid this." Thomas watched her, his expression a mix of bewilderment and unease. His eyes flickered between the pouch and her tear-streaked face. He slowly reached out, his calloused fingers carefully taking the pouch. His touch was gentle. He opened the leather flap, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pulled out the folded parchment, the old paper's dry rustle filling the kitchen's silence as Eleanor watched him, strained, waiting for his reaction, for belief or dismissal. Her heart was a frantic, caged bird. She felt Arthur's lingering presence, watching, waiting with them. Thomas unfolded the deed with meticulous care, his eyes tracing the faded ink, the script, the seals. The silence stretched, broken only by a distant crow's caw and Eleanor's frantic heart, as she saw his jaw clench, his lips thin into a grim line. His gaze lingered on a specific section, then moved to the old signatures. The brothers' shared history, the land, the family legacy, all coalesced in that brittle document. "This is the original deed," Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible, profound shock rippling through his composed demeanor. He looked up, his brown eyes, raw with emotion, meeting hers. This proves the old claim, does it not? The land around the mill, the pasture by the creek, it was always ours. Eleanor nodded, tears overflowing, streaming down her cheeks. Yes, Arthur found it. He hid it in the old mill's foundation. He knew he was in danger. He was leaving us away to fight. Profound sadness washed over Thomas's face, deeper than Eleanor had seen, and the guarded wariness crumbled, replaced by devastating grief for his brother, grief suppressed since Arthur's death. He looked back at the deed, his thumb gently caressing the brittle paper. The weight of his brother's foresight and sacrifice pressed down on him. Arthur never trusted Blackwood, Thomas said, his voice husky with emotion. He always said that man would take everything given an inch. I did not think. He trailed off, realizing he had not thought it would cost Arthur his life. His eyes, fixed on the deed, swam with unshed tears as he clenched his free hand into a fist on the table, knuckles white. The old arguments, their estrangements, reasons, now seemed petty, insignificant against this terrible truth. Arthur, his younger brother, had died protecting their heritage, while Thomas had been miles away, nursing an old grudge. Bitter regret washed over him, making him sag in his seat. Eleanor watched him, her own pain forgotten by his raw, exposed grief, seeing the regret deepen around his eyes, the sorrow in his posture. He looked up again, his gaze full of aching vulnerability. He told me once, Thomas began, his voice barely a whisper, that if anything happened, I had to look after you, look after the farm. I dismissed it, told him he was overly dramatic. Now I understand. He shook his head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He put his trust in me, Eleanor. Even after everything, he still trusted me. The words were a confession, a plea for forgiveness she had not realized he needed. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering his clenched fist. Her touch was soft, comforting. He loved you, Thomas, she whispered, her own tears flowing freely now, tears of shared grief and understanding. He never stopped. He spoke of you often, even when you were not speaking. Thomas closed his eyes, a silent battle raging inside him. Memories of his brothers, their childhood on this farm, their shared dreams and eventual rift, mingled with Arthur's orchestrated death. He thought of Blackwood, his arrogant smile, his relentless pursuit of power. The injustice of it, the cold-blooded calculation behind Arthur's murder, ignited a slow fury within him. He opened his eyes, a new fire gleaming, replacing sorrow with steely resolve, then looked at Eleanor, his gaze steady and unwavering. He saw not just his sister-in-law, but a woman who endured unthinkable loss, fought alone against a powerful enemy, and came to him, vulnerable and desperate, seeking his help. He saw Arthur's legacy in her eyes and her fierce spirit. He carefully refolded the deed, placing it back into the leather pouch. His hands, which moments before trembled with grief, now moved with deliberate, purposeful strength, pushing the pouch across the table to Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement of her courage and discovery. Blackwood will pay for this, Thomas stated, his voice low, firm, devoid of doubt. He will pay for what he did to Arthur, and for trying to take this land. The anger was palpable in his tone, a cold, hard edge promising retribution. Eleanor felt profound relief wash over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. The suffocating weight of fighting alone, of carrying this burden, began to lift. A fragile seed of hope, long dormant, began to sprout in her barren grief. Thomas rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. He walked around the table, stopping beside her. He reached out, his large hands settling firmly on her shoulder, a warm, reassuring grip grounding her in her emotions' swirling chaos, a gesture of solidarity and unwavering support. "We will face him, Eleanor," Thomas declared, his eyes filled with sorrow and renewed purpose. "We will face Blackwood together, no matter the cost." The words were a solemn vow, a promise forged in shared grief and renewed family bond. Morning light touched the fields as Eleanor and Thomas left the farm. The old truck rattled, a sound that usually comforted, now only tightened Eleanor's stomach. She held the worn leather bag, feeling the deed inside. Thomas drove, a heavy look on his face. Their silence was thick with shared grief and grim resolve. Each bump on the road reminded Eleanor of Arthur. She watched the landscape blur, each landmark a memory of him. A bitter ache filled her chest, a mix of love and sadness for his silent struggle. Thomas cleared his throat. Arthur always said good people lived in the next town, he murmured, his voice gentle. He spoke of Mr. Davies, a lawyer who put justice first. Eleanor nodded, grateful for his words. She saw Arthur, younger, eyes bright with conviction, a memory both close and distant. The drive felt endless. Dust from the road coated Eleanor's tongue. Her knuckles whitened as she clutched the bag. Thomas met her gaze, his expression a mixture of grief and resolve. "We will do this right, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady. "For Arthur." A single tear slipped down her cheek, not just from sorrow, but from a renewed purpose. Confronting Blackwood now filled her with a cold, righteous fury. The town hummed with quiet life, a change from the farm's desolation. Mr. Davies' office stood on a quiet side street, a modest building with a faded sign. Eleanor felt apprehension climbing the 3 worn wooden steps. Inside, old paper and wood scented the air. A ticking grandfather clock reminded them of time. Mr. Davies, an old man with a face like carved oak and keen eyes, greeted them. He pointed to 2 worn leather chairs. Eleanor placed the leather pouch on his desk. Thomas sat rigid beside her. "Mr. Davies," Eleanor began, her voice steady, "we have something to show you." She told him about Arthur's final days, Blackwood's threats, her search, and finding the deed in the mill. She spoke of Arthur's foresight and his silent burden. Mr. Davies listened, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled. He let Eleanor pour out her grief and suspicion. His gaze remained steady, absorbing every word. When she finished, only the clock ticked. Sweat trickled down Eleanor's temple. Thomas squeezed her hand. Mr. Davies slowly reached for the pouch. He untied the string and carefully unfolded the brittle parchment. The yellow deed lay flat, its faded ink legible. He leaned close, tracing the old script, his lips moving. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding. This was the moment of truth. He spent a long time examining the document, cross-referencing details. Eleanor felt time stretch. She pictured Arthur, hunched over similar papers, protecting their legacy. A deep sadness for his absence washed over her. Mr. Davies finally straightened, nodding thoughtfully. He removed his spectacles. "This is remarkable, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice firm. "This deed is absolutely valid. It predates Blackwood's claims by decades. It establishes your family's rightful ownership of the land, including the mill and acreage." Eleanor gasped, a painful relief flooding her. Thomas let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing. Arthur had been right. His final act was their salvation. But Mr. Davies' expression turned serious. "However," he said, "Silas Blackwood is powerful. He has deep pockets and connections. He will not concede easily. This deed is only the start of your fight. He will try to discredit it, and you, with legal challenges until you break." A cold knot formed in Eleanor's stomach. She knew this, but hearing it made it terrifying. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice sharp. "How do we fight him?" Mr. Davies leaned back. "We fight him with truth openly," he stated. "This deed and its story must see the light. We prove your ownership, expose his claims, and uncover Arthur's true death." Eleanor's breath hitched. The public accusation of murder terrified her. "Arthur's death," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can we prove it?" "We can raise questions," Mr. Davies replied. "His death, before Blackwood's land grab, with this ownership proof, creates a compelling narrative. We will suggest the official cause was premature. We will push for an investigation." Eleanor imagined headlines, whispers, accusations. It was terrifying, yet the only way to honor Arthur. Thomas squeezed her hand. "We must be meticulous," Mr. Davies explained, pulling paper and pen. "Every detail, event, and threat needs documentation. We need a clear timeline, a narrative beyond doubt." They spent hours strategizing. Mr. Davies outlined filing an injunction, contacting local media for public pressure. Eleanor listened, her mind racing, absorbing his precise, logical advice. We will prepare a public statement, Mr. Davies said, writing, declaring your family's claim with this deed. We will also request a review of Arthur's death, connecting Blackwood's greed to the tragedy. A cold shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. Accusing a man like Blackwood was an act of profound courage or desperation. He will not take kindly to this, Thomas interjected, his eyes dark. He will come for us, Eleanor. Indeed, Mr. Davies agreed. Our strategy must be swift. We strike before his counterattack. Surprise and evidence are our weapons. He looked at Eleanor. Are you prepared for this, Mrs. Vance? This will be a fight for your life, your legacy, and Arthur's memory. Eleanor's fingers locked onto the armrest. She took a deep breath. I am, she stated, her voice firm. Grief was a raw wound, fear a companion, but steel resolve had hardened. She had lost too much to turn back. For Arthur, for her home, she would face it. They detailed Blackwood's intimidations, boundary notices, and land surveys. Eleanor recounted every suspicious incident. Thomas added his observations, strengthening their case. They discussed the initial police report on Arthur's death, the quick dismissal of foul play. Mr. Davies took careful notes, building their case. The afternoon sun filled the office. Each detail they provided, each note Mr. Davies made, built their confidence. The old deed, once silent, now roared with Arthur's voice demanding justice. Eleanor felt exhausted yet exhilarated. The pain of Arthur's loss was immense, but fighting for his truth brought purpose. Thomas, usually reserved, spoke with quiet passion. Their alliance felt solid. As they gathered belongings, the deed in Eleanor's bag now felt like a shield. The clock urged them on. Mr. Davies shook their hands. We have a strong case, he assured them, but Blackwood will fight. Stay vigilant. Stay united. They stepped into the bright afternoon light. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the street from habit. Thomas walked beside her, a comforting presence. They had taken the first step. Then a low hum caught Eleanor's attention. A sleek black car, gleaming, glided slowly past the curb. Tinted windows hid its occupant. It moved with predatory grace, too deliberate for this quiet town. Eleanor felt an icy knot. She exchanged a quick glance with Thomas. The car, clearly Blackwood's, disappeared around the corner, a chilling warning that they were being watched. The scent of stale coffee and nervous anticipation filled the courthouse air. Eleanor gripped Thomas's hand, her heart beating fast. The heavy oak doors promised either liberation or a crushing blow. Thomas's solid touch anchored her unease. Mr. Davies, their elderly lawyer, spoke calmly. Fear and determination filled Eleanor. She thought of Arthur, a ghost of encouragement. They stepped into the courtroom, polished wood and hushed whispers. Curious stares followed her. Silas Blackwood sat opposite, his cold eyes a challenge. Eleanor met his gaze, refusing to flinch. This was for Arthur, for justice. The proceedings began. Mr. Davies spoke of the Vance family's long history, the harassment, the boundary disputes. The judge listened keenly. Eleanor thought of Arthur's unwavering belief. Eleanor walked to the witness stand. Her legs felt heavy. She saw sympathy and skepticism in the gallery. Her voice was shaky at first. She spoke of Arthur, their life on the farm, their heritage. She described the cut fences, the constant pressure, Blackwood's threats. Her voice grew stronger. You found something, Mrs. Vance, Mr. Davies prompted. She looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragement. Arthur left a deed, she said, her voice steady. Blackwood's face hardened. He knew this day would come. Mr. Davies presented the yellowed parchment. He explained its history, its validity, showing the land, including the old mill, belonged to the Vances. A murmur spread. Blackwood's lawyer objected, calling it an ancient relic. But Mr. Davies dismantled each argument, proving the deed's power. Blackwood's fury grew, his composure cracking. Eleanor felt fear and triumph. This was Arthur's final protection. Thomas spoke quietly but firmly. He told of Arthur, their childhood at the mill, his brother's deep connection to the land. He recounted their estrangement, his regret, and Eleanor's proof that Arthur's death was not accidental. My brother knew this land, Thomas said. He would not have fallen, not with Blackwood circling. Blackwood's lawyer suggested a vendetta, trying to discredit Eleanor. Thomas stood firm. The evidence was clear. Silas Blackwood rose, ignoring his lawyer. His voice, laced with venom, echoed. "This is a farce," he declared, locking on to Eleanor. "Her husband was a fool. You think a scrap of old paper changes anything?" His eyes burned. Eleanor felt dread, then thought of Arthur's sacrifice, the hidden deed. The judge intervened. "Mr. Blackwood, that is enough. Resume your seat, or I will hold you in contempt." Her authority was absolute. Blackwood, stunned, slowly retreated, his face enraged. A collective sigh followed. The tide had turned. Mr. Davies detailed Blackwood's intimidation, fraudulent claims, and the deed's proof. He spoke of Blackwood's greed and connected it to Arthur's death. The judge withdrew. Eleanor waited, her heart beating fast. Thomas squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support. The judge returned, expression unreadable. Eleanor held her breath. "The court finds in favor of Mrs. Eleanor Vance," the judge said. "The deed is valid, confirming the Vance family's ownership. Silas Blackwood's claims are null and void." Relief washed over Eleanor. Tears blurred her eyes. The farm was safe. Furthermore, the judge continued, looking at Blackwood, "Given the evidence of harassment and Arthur Vance's suspicious death, the court orders an investigation. Mr. Blackwood is to be taken into custody." Blackwood erupted, but bailiffs moved swiftly, securing his wrists. His arrogant demeanor shattered. Eleanor watched him, a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. He would answer for Arthur's death. Justice had arrived. Outside, the sun felt bright. Reporters swarmed, but Mr. Davies handled them. Eleanor leaned on Thomas, drained but lighter. Tears of relief fell. Thomas held her, rubbing her back. Days later, the Vance homestead hummed. Eleanor walked through the fields, feeling the earth. Fences were repaired, stronger. Thomas had been working, bringing new life to Arthur's old workshop. Eleanor found him by the barn, mending a gate. He looked up. "Looks good," she said. "Almost done," he replied. "The old place needed love." She nodded. They stood in silence, watching the sun set. Eleanor looked at the land, now hers again. Arthur's loss was an ache, but peace settled. Justice for Arthur meant exposing the truth, ensuring Blackwood could harm no one else. "He would be proud, Eleanor," Thomas said. Eleanor whispered, "I hope so. I hope he knows." She looked at Thomas, the brother Arthur loved. Their shared grief had forged an unbreakable bond. The sun dipped. Eleanor stood on her secure farm with Thomas. A shared understanding passed between them, a promise to rebuild their future. Arthur's legacy lived on in the land and its people. Pain lingered, but hope shone in the fading light.